Well, how's it going, everybody? I'm Sam. I'm a pastor. I've been a pastor for 23 years. I'm a biblical studies student, a Bible teacher, and you can read the stuff I write on samberg.org. Just go there, click posts, and you can scroll down and find all that stuff there. Today, we're going to look at, I wanted to do it yesterday, didn't get to it, but today we're going to look at the Synoptic Gospels, especially the Olivet Discourse, to talk about eschatology in the Synoptic Gospels. We've been doing kind of this series we looked at Pauline epistles and their eschatology and what Paul thinks about end time stuff and what he teaches through those different letters. We looked at Revelation, and we looked at how to view Revelation, maybe how to read Revelation differently, and what the eschatology looks like there. We're going to look at the Olivet Discourse specifically today in both Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all three of those. And we're going to take a look at them from the vantage point of how were they constructed, how were they written, why did they line up so much, and why do they differ? Why are there contrasts there in this discourse? And find out, what is it trying to tell us about eschatology versus what it was trying to tell us about history versus what was maybe prophetically coming from Jesus. And so I've had some people ask and had comments about, well, why, it seems like it can line up a lot of this stuff in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but some of this stuff just feels like it doesn't line up. Why doesn't it line up? I want to kind of try to give you my perspective on that, and we're going to dive into the synoptic problem a little more. We had a video on that probably 3 or 4 times ago. So if you want to know more about that, go back to that and then come here. But we're going to dive into that, and I want to show you how what I think is going on is that Mark was written first. Matthew uses Mark as his source, and then Luke comes later and uses both Matthew and Mark as their source, plus other stuff. And Luke changes the most. Matthew follows Mark pretty closely, but Luke changes the most. And so I want to talk about why that could be. All right, so I'm going to jump over here. We're going to look through the passage. I have them all highlighted to show you all the difference. And then once we get from there, then we'll walk back in and talk about eschatology versus history and all that kind of stuff in these Gospels. All right, here we go. The Synoptic Gospels of the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. That's where you'll find these. And so what I have here is the text that's highlighted in yellow. These are the texts that are going to be either very similar or exactly 100% the same in all 3 of these accounts. And I have them going from left to right here. Mark 13 first, because as I have already alluded to, I believe Mark wrote his gospel first. And there's a good reason to believe that Mark wrote his gospel somewhere between 68 to 70-ish AD. And it's pretty reasonable to even think that he wrote it before the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. I personally am under the opinion that Matthew wrote second, using Mark as his source, and I'm going to point that out very specifically here. And that probably was in the early 70s, early to mid 70s. And then I'm of the opinion Luke went last, and he actually used Matthew heavily as his source, and then used Mark also as a source, and then he had his own sources as well. I think Matthew had his own sources too. We're going to see that a little bit here. But Luke tends to disagree with Matthew on some things and with Mark, and then sometimes Luke just takes his own path. And so we're going to see that in this, okay? So as you can see here, in Mark 13, we go starting verse 1. It says, he came out of the temple. One of his disciples said to him, "Look, teacher, what large stones, what large buildings." Then Jesus asked him, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down. And you see the same thing pretty much across the board in Matthew and in Luke. And both of them, like I said, are probably using Mark as their source for this. And that's why it looks identical. In fact, Luke's probably using Matthew also. And we're going to see some of the things that they correct. And this is why I say that Luke uses Matthew, maybe not Mark. Because look at here. Mark puts, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. Matthew uses Mark. It says, when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives. Luke doesn't even, look at that. Doesn't put anything there. He's just like, this is not important an important detail that I need to put in here. And this says it's opposite of the temple. That's what Mark wanted to say there, to try to show you where the Mount of Olives is. Peter, James, and John and Andrew asked him privately. And green is what Matthew and Mark are going to have the same, but not Luke. Okay, so when he was sitting on the Mount of Olives there in Matthew, the disciples, so Matthew says, well, it wasn't just Peter, James, John, and Andrew who came over. It was all the disciples came over to him privately saying or asking. And then look at what happens here. It says they asked him teacher in Luke, but it doesn't have that in the rest of these. And then in blue here is where Luke and Mark are going to agree, where Luke is drawing from Mark. It says, tell us when will this be, and what will be the sign that all these things are about to be accomplished? Look at Luke. When will this be, and what will be the sign that this is about to take place? Very similar language here, but look at what Matthew does. Tell us when this will be, and what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? See, this is Matthew, in my opinion here. This is Matthew drawing from Daniel 7. Coming at the end of the age. Matthew is obsessed with this idea of the end of the age. He's obsessed with the signs of Jesus' coming. And so he's going to write that over and over again here. Mark is very different. Sometimes he'll write that, sometimes he won't. Luke is going to have a very different perspective here. Luke is going to write something very different than the other two when it comes to some of this stuff. And I think there's a very good reason for it, and I'll get to it when we get there. It says right here that Jesus began to say to them, beware that no one leads you astray. This is Mark. Many will come in my name, say, I am he. They will lead many astray. When you hear of wars, rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. But the end is still to come, for nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will be famines. This is but the beginning of the birth pangs. Then he says, as for yourselves, beware, for they will hand you over to councils, and you will be beaten in synagogues. And that's where the agreement across the board kind of stops here, okay? Now look at what Matthew does. Matthew pretty much copies word for word what Mark says here. Jesus answered them, beware that no one leads you astray, for many will come in my name, saying I am the Messiah. He didn't say I am he. He says I am the Messiah, because that's Matthew writing to a Jewish audience, wanting to make sure that that is something that he puts in there. It's a big theme for Matthew. And they will lead many astray. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not alarmed, for this must take place, but the end is not yet. Mark says the end is still to come. He says the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All this is but the beginning of the birth pangs. This is like word for word. It says, then they will hand you over to be tortured instead of beaten in synagogues. It says they will hand you over to be tortured and will put you to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. Matthew doesn't really say who they are. And it's probably because he's writing to a Jewish audience, and he doesn't want to be pointing out this idea that the Jewish people are going to be in the synagogues beating them and flogging them, and it's not the councils you'll be handed over to. So just know that in the back of your mind. This is maybe what Matthew's doing here to correct Mark, and to kind of skew it towards his audience. Then many will fall away, and they will betray one another and hate one another. That's not in either of these other two. Look what Luke does here. He says, and he said, beware that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name and saying, I am he. So he's kind of going with Mark a little more. He's not having to write to a Jewish audience, so he's not saying Messiah. And look what he says here. And the time is near. Do not go after them. And then he says, when you hear of wars, and not rumors of wars, but you hear of wars and insurrections, do not be terrified, for these things must take place first, but the end will not follow immediately. This is very interesting, by the way. Then he said to them, nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be great earthquakes in various places, famines and plagues, and there will be dreadful portents and great signs from heaven. But before all this occurs, they will arrest you and persecute you. They will hand you over to synagogues and prisons. So he's kind of doing both of these. I probably should have highlighted this synagogues as there. So we can kind of put those together. And you will be brought before kings and governors. This is what, Mark is going to say over here too. He says, you'll stand before governors and kings because of me as a testimony to them. You'll be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify, same kind of a thing. Look what Mark says here. He says, and the good news must first be proclaimed to all the nations. And then he says, when they bring you to trial and hand you over, do not worry beforehand about what you're to say, but say whatever is given you at the time, for it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. Sibling will betray sibling to death, and a father his child, and children will rise against parents and have them put to death. And you'll be hated by all because of my name. And look what he says over here. You'll be brought before kings and governors because of my name. This will give you an opportunity to testify. So make up your minds not to prepare your defense in advance, for I will give you words and a wisdom that none of your opponents will be able to withstand or contradict. You'll be betrayed by even parents and siblings, by relatives and friends, and they will put some of you to death. You will be hated by all because of my name. But look what he says here. But not a hair of your head will perish. And then he says, by your endurance you will gain your souls. But the one who endures the end will be saved. And here in Matthew, but the one who endures the end will be saved. So it's all there. Matthew skips over this whole middle part here. And I'm not quite sure why Matthew chooses to skip that, except for the fact that maybe it won't benefit his audience that he's writing to. And so he makes a choice there. And then verse 11, and many false prophets will arise and lead many astray. And because of the increase of lawlessness, the love of many will grow cold. And then he says, and this good news of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come, which is probably drawing here from, we could probably highlight this and say this is kind of Matthew's way of expounding upon Mark here. So we'll highlight that one green and say that is Matthew maybe expounding upon Mark there. But there's several areas where Matthew and Luke deviate from Mark in very different directions. Sometimes Luke chooses Mark and what he says here and puts that in there, even though Matthew isn't there. So some of this is what has caused some people to say, well, no, Matthew used Mark as a source, and then Luke used Mark as a source also. But it wasn't that Luke used Matthew. I think there's more of an opportunity to say that Luke is using both of these as his source. And I'll talk about that when you look at Luke chapter 1, when we look there for a second. But I think Luke is writing much later. I think the best place to date Luke is no earlier than mid to late 70s, because he is using both of these and because of what he says at the beginning of his gospel. And because of the actual historicity of the things that he changes. We look at Mark and we look at Matthew, and a lot of what they are saying is not so much historically accurate to what happens. Then you look at Luke, and what Luke has to say, especially in this next section, is way more historically accurate to what happens. And it's almost as if Luke knows what's about to happen, knows what was going on, and he changes some of that to make it more historically accurate, to show what actually happened here. Okay, so here it is. Here's where the biggest changes happen. Notice all the green here. That means that this is where Matthew and Mark agree, or this is where Matthew is borrowing from Mark. The yellow here is where they all have the same thing together. The places where Matthew chooses not to borrow from Mark is a couple of things that I think when we see them, we'll understand exactly why Matthew chooses to add this. Look, when you see the desolating sacrilege set up, look what he says here. Where it ought not to be. That's Mark's version of it. Let the reader understand. Matthew takes what Mark writes and he corrects it. He changes it and he shows you, no, this is what this actually means. So when you see the desolating sacrilege spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Matthew changes Mark's wording here because Mark probably knows the quote, but he doesn't know where it's from, and he doesn't know why it's written there. Matthew is like, no, this is from Daniel, and he's not just where he ought not to be, he is in the holy place. And so he spells it out for his audience, because his audience, remember, is Jewish. He's writing for a Jewish audience, Matthew is. And so he's trying to connect over and over again back to the Hebrew Bible to show, look, this is who Jesus is. This is what he said. And so Matthew has, like I already said, has Daniel 7 in his mind from the beginning of this passage. And so that's why he's so obsessed with Jesus, the Messiah's coming, his second coming. And he's so obsessed with the end of the age, and he's obsessed with this stuff because Daniel 7 is already in his mind. And then he says, then let those in Judea, they must flee to the mountains. Both of those said that. And then all the way down here, this is where they all agree. It's almost the exact same word for word passage, except for in verse 20 in Matthew, pray that your flight may not be in winter. That's in both of them. But then Matthew adds, or on a Sabbath, which well, of course we would add that if we're speaking to a Jewish audience. Okay, Mark isn't. Mark is just writing this down, and so he doesn't have to add these things in. Matthew does. Matthew adds at the end of this, he says, be alert, I've already told you everything. If there's the false messiahs that pop up, whatever. And he says this, so if they say to you, Matthew says, so if they say to you, look, he's in the wilderness, do not go out. If they say, look, he's in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes as far as the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever the corpse is, there the eagles will gather. There's that Son of Man thing again, Daniel 7. Daniel 7, okay? We need to understand that that's what's in Matthew's mind as he's writing this part of the Olivet Discourse. Look what Luke does, though. Luke has a few things that this is what shows me that he's using both of these, but then Luke goes out on a limb and does his own thing. They both said, when you see the desolating sacrilege set up, which is like, my guess is this is what the source that they're using said. Luke decides to go, let me tell you about the real history. He says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. Luke is correcting Mark and Matthew here historically. And he's saying, no, this is what happened. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. It's where it shouldn't be. These armies are coming to destroy the temple. Then those in Judea must flee to the mountains. And this is exactly what happened. The armies of Rome came to destroy. There was an insurrection that came, which Luke already talked about. If you see an insurrection, beware. So Luke is recounting the actual history of what's going on. And he says, then if you see this starting to happen, run. The other ones are just taking whatever it is that was probably in front of them as a source and saying, this is what it is. And Luke is saying, let me correct this. Luke is writing more historically accurate things here that we know actually happened in history, and saying, no, this is actually what it is. This is actually what Jesus, and we don't know if this is what the tradition was that was taught, was said, and that Matthew and Mark are just writing down whatever the sources were in front of them, and Luke is like, no, this was the interpreted tradition of what it meant, and we saw this happen, so let me show you this. And he wants to maybe show that Jesus actually knew what he was talking about. And he says, and those inside the city must leave it, and those out in the country must not enter it, for these are days of vengeance, as a fulfillment of all that is written. In Luke's mind here, as he's writing the Olivet Discourse and having Jesus speak about it, Jesus is saying this is the fulfillment of all that stuff that was going on, that was talked about in the Old Testament, the day of vengeance, the day of wrath, all this kind of stuff. How do I know that? Because of what he chooses to say that the other ones don't. He says, woe to those who are pregnant and those who are nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress on the earth. Both of those have said that. Matthew and Mark have also said that, but this is what he says. And wrath against this people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be taken away as captives among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled on by the nations until the times of the nations are fulfilled. Luke is trying to give us history. Luke is telling us this is what happened in AD 70 with Jerusalem, with the temple, all of this stuff, because that's how it starts. That not one of these stones will be standing on top of each other, right? Matthew and Mark are probably staying closer to the source material. Luke is telling us what happened in history, and he's interpreting that source material, and that's what I think is going on here. And then you can see again, continuing on, Luke continues to break away from the other two. Here's where they have in common: those days after suffering, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will be falling from heaven, staying really close to the source. Luke just says there are going to be signs in the sun, moon, and stars on the earth, and distress among the nations, confused by the roaring of the sea and the waves. People will faint from fear and foreboding of what is coming upon the world because of what is happening. It says, for all the powers of heaven will be shaken, just like they said in the other ones. Then you'll see the Son of Man coming on a cloud with great power and glory. And notice how Mark writes this small little thing here. Matthew expounds upon it. Luke really expounds upon it. But they have things that are very similar and the same. The sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. Remember, Daniel 7. Sign of the Son of Man will appear in the heaven, and all the tribes of the earth will mourn. With a loud trumpet call here. That's another, this Daniel 7 again. And then look what Luke says. Now, when these things begin to take place, stand up, raise your heads, your redemption is drawing near. And then it talks about the fig tree. And this last little piece of the fig tree here, it's like a direct copy and paste, except for Luke talks about the one thing that the other two don't. And it's fascinating because in Mark and Matthew, there is a stronger kingdom of God connection. But notice what Luke says here. Luke says, when you see these things taking place, you know the kingdom of God is near. The other two say that you know that he is near. But Luke says, you know the kingdom of God is near. But why does he know that? Why does he say that? Well, in my opinion, he says that is because he's writing after the fact. Matthew and Mark, Matthew may even be writing pretty close to 70, or maybe Matthew's writing before 70. Maybe we can even say that maybe Mark and Matthew are closer to the time. Maybe Mark is 67, Matthew maybe right before the destruction of the temple. I think it's probably a little bit after. He's just using whatever Mark wrote there. Luke is definitely later, because Luke is correcting these two by recounting the actual history of what happened. And so what we see in Luke is we see an accurate, orderly thing that he's writing out that accounts the real history of what happened. So he knows he's not near. He says the kingdom of God is near. And this is his way of kind of correcting these two and saying this is how this goes. He said, truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place. And he knows that because here he is writing after they've taken place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. So you go back to Luke chapter 1. And what does Luke say in Luke chapter 1? As he's writing his account, and this is where I say that he's maybe using Matthew and Mark, but he's kind of going his own way because he probably has other sources as well. And he's probably heard some, different witness accounts. Here's what the NRSV says. He says, since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. So he has these accounts already taken, and he has eyewitness people who have handed down things from the eyewitnesses. He says, I too decided after investigating everything carefully from the very first to write an orderly account. And so that's what we see. We see him investigating everything, taking into account all of the history that's gone on, and he's writing after the fact. And so what I would say to anybody who would say this is eschatology, I would say, no, this is recounting history. Now, this may have been as Jesus is prophesying, and they're putting this in the mouth of Jesus. This is future to Jesus because Jesus lived in the 30s, and this happened in the 70s, like 60 and 70, late 60s, early, like before 70 AD. But this is not end of the world stuff. But we tend to read this and think that this is the end of the world.
that this is, the end of, because he says end of the age, then that this must be what he's talking about here. Now, he goes on to talk about some other things that I'll cover in another video, but I just wanted to show how a lot of this popular Olivet Discourse stuff has nothing to do with the end of the world. It had to do with AD 70 and the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, and he was very clear about that, setting that up, and that this is why the accounts don't always agree. It's not because one is futuristic and one is history. It's because Luke knows stuff that Matthew and that Mark definitely didn't know, but was trying to say that Jesus predicted, and that Matthew was using Mark as a source, but kind of making it more Jewish. Luke knows the history, he knows what's going on, and he's trying to be more accurate with the history. And I think that's why we place Luke's gospel later, earliest probably mid 70s, but it's more likely in the 80s. So yeah.
Well, hopefully that was informational and helpful for you as you're trying to navigate some of this stuff. I would love to interact with you in the comments section about all this kind of stuff. If you have a different opinion, I would love to hear it. But yeah, so thanks for hanging out with me today. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.